That never happens to Citibank. They get bailed out time and time again, and it's just, it's a very jarring contrast.
Yeah, it really it was jarring. I think Riston has developed, because of the rhetoric, a kind of a very positive reputation among people who like free markets and like free enterprise. And he was, I think, like a lot of people, he was all for them until it was his interest at stake, and then he very much welcomed or encouraged government intervention. And I think the whole premise of their strategy, we talked about the Latin American lending, is he's also famous for saying that countries never go bankrupt, and he somehow persuaded a lot of people in this town to believe that lending to developing countries was as safe as it gets, as safe as lending to the U.S. Treasury, and obviously that didn't turn out to be the case. But yeah, the distance between Riston's rhetoric and the reality of Citi in that period was quite large.
But we do have, there's a tension here, at least it seems to me, when we think about the good old days, say, before Citibank started having troubles, and it and several other big U.S. banks were famous for being solid. I think it was Chemical that was known as Old Bullion because they had all this gold, and there were other banks that just put their money in securities and no loans practically, that sort of thing. But these were also, as was mentioned, banks that for the most part were dealing with relatively well-to-do, wealthy people, and not ordinary depositors, and they certainly didn't make loans to regular folk, and yes, they didn't make loans to the third world, or they weren't generous in their mortgages, but it seems I doubt very many people could imagine going back to that kind of world, though there are certain proponents of reform who might take us there if we were to follow their advice. But how can we have the baby, as it were, of a well-banked society, to use the phrase that's now, I think, fairly current, without the bathwater of bailouts?
Well, I think the history does tell us that there isn't a connection, but a tight connection between expanding credit to the consumer and crises. In other words, that expansion we were talking about in the 20s of Citi really leading the way on bringing lots of people into the financial system who in an earlier era wouldn't have had the means to do that. They really weren't the reason they got into trouble. It was overseas investments. It was not that they overdid it with the American consumer so much. But I would also point out, and I think this is the constant problem in this town especially, is that it is seen as all upside when government is encouraging banks to expand credit with the premise of a bailout if they run into trouble, allowing them to run with very high leverage and to make loans to, especially housing has been a problem. But we do have to remember what the cost was to the average person in terms of the slow growth that really persisted for most of a decade after the last crisis. The hit to savers of having these rock bottom interest rates engineered by the Fed to somehow try and conjure growth after the last crisis. So the bill will be paid, but often later and for many years afterwards.
Chrissy, do you have any further thoughts on that?
Well, I wasn't going to comment on that, but if you
please, anything you would
else.
like to get off your chest, just go for it.
Go for it. Well, I guess I want to underscore again, just looking at the history, the inherent fragility of the American financial system. And I think probably a lot of people here in the audience, at least, know a little bit more about the history of banking than your average American. But I think most people don't realize that compared to Western Europe and Canada, we had an unusually fragile system. You had all these little banks that weren't allowed to branch, so they're tied to one little economy. If the crop doesn't come in that year, then everything goes under. You couldn't move money around easily, even with the correspondent banking system. Money flows into New York, then gets pulled back out depending on the season and what's needed. And a lot of it's tied up in call loans and such. But we have it all split up. We have the state banks and we have the federal banks, and in the 30s we split them between the investment banks and the commercial banks. So you have this just unusually fragmented, very fragile system. And so then when you start to layer some of the things we've been talking about on top of it, some of the riskiness and the problems of moral hazard with the understanding that there'll be bailouts, yeah, it's very problematic.
Yeah, I think you make a good point, Christy. I've always thought it was the great tragedy of American banking history that we endured unit banking for most of our history, finally got away from it, but only did so when too big to fail was really in the saddle, as it were. That happened with Conti in the 70s. And so now, next thing you know, we have the opposite problem of banks that are getting too big and expecting that they must, that they can rely on bailouts as a result. At least that's one way of seeing things. Can you have big banks in the end and not have this dilemma? There used to be a lot more discussion about breaking up banks that were too big to fail. That seems to not be happening so much. Gary, do you know why we don't hear much about breaking them up?
One of my predecessors at the Minneapolis Fed, Neil Kashkari, came out with a proposal to shrink the big banks. It's not a proposal that I personally am enthusiastic about. You know, it's kind of nice to say, well, if they're too big to fail, they're too big, but that's a slogan. That doesn't really tell you what you ought to do in a policy sense. And besides, I think we all know, if we take a step back, it's size alone is not going to tell you what needs to be done. It has a lot more to do with complexity and so forth. We shouldn't, I mean, I guess I would say we shouldn't be surprised that there are losses in a market capitalistic economy. I mean, that's you get the upside, you should also get the downside. The problem is, of course, that the people who should have gotten at least a part of the downside didn't get it. And I alluded earlier to uninsured creditors. If you were an equity holder in Citi, especially if you were an undiversified equity holder, you lost a lot of money, or in Lehman Brothers, or I mean, your net worth, you know, depending on how many shares you had, your net worth took a very big hit. But uninsured creditors, on the other hand, that's a different story, and that's where the rubber hits the road and too big to fail. As I already commented, I think the living will aspects of Dodd-Frank have the promise of helping in that regard. But having said that, I agree. You know, it hasn't been tested. Legislation could come along and undermine it in a crisis. You know, whether that's good or bad would remain to be seen. It's a cost-benefit question. It's not obvious that all too big to fail actions are bad. It all depends on what the cost of not doing it would have been. And in a crisis, you know, you don't have the luxury of doing those kinds of calculations at your leisure. You've got to make decisions, and we shouldn't be surprised that not all decisions made in the midst of a serious crisis, with the benefit of hindsight, we shouldn't be surprised that they all don't look wise or just in some sense. You know, it would be great if policymakers were sufficiently clairvoyant, but you know, they're not. They're like people like us.
I mean, I would say I'm very skeptical of the idea that you have plans to break up the banks. I mean, who's going to do that? It's going to be the regulators and the supervisors. They're conflicted. There's this idea that there's an optimal level or optimal size for an institution, and I can't see at all that that's a concept.
I think the directors of these organizations do have some real responsibilities, just to follow up on Vern's point. I mean, if I'm not a director of any of these SIFIs, but if I were, I would be pressing management really hard about what lines of business does it really make sense to be in, what lines don't, what geographic regions does it make sense to be in, what geographic regions don't make sense, and all those kinds of questions. I think directors have a role to play, and maybe they're doing it. I mean, I'm not a party to those board meetings, but it seems to me that you know, given what we've been through, if you're an independent director on those boards, you should be asking some serious questions.
So my wrap-up question for everybody, I think I'd like to throw a little bit of a curveball. It's tempting to ask just for a summing up of the lessons we should draw from Citibank's story. But I'd actually like to particularly ask the authors, what would be the wrong lesson to draw from your book? Suppose, if you had to worry about a reader reading your book and getting the wrong conclusion out of that story, what might that be, and can you warn us against it?
Well, I am worried that a supervisor or a regulator, whether it's in the U.S. or elsewhere, looks at this and says, oh, this is like a menu that we can choose from the various ways to bail out institutions, and that's certainly not the intention.
Guide.
Yeah, how-to guide of, oh, we can do it this way, we can do it through our central bank discount window lending, or we can do it through a capital program, or you know, the whole laundry list as you go through.
Do you worry that people might read the book and say, Citibank is such a colorful case, so unique. These guys have written this book about it, obviously because it stands out, but that's just Citibank. We don't really have to worry about other banks. They haven't got these problems.
Well, we can't know, and I think that's I don't know if they get it from our book or be pushed away from this conclusion by our book, but this ongoing problem of a lack of transparency. I mentioned earlier this term shadow banking, which the Fed and other regulators use to refer to the financial system that they don't regulate, is much more transparent. It was not, as you're going to hear a lot in these 10th anniversary reviews of the crisis, the entire story. Citibank was overseen by multiple federal banking regulators. There was nothing that was in the shadows and not covered. The entirety of the operation was overseen by bank regulators, and as we look back and we try, whether it's Citi or any other bank, we want to learn the lessons of what worked and what didn't. We really are limited in that way because records of bank examiners are basically withheld from the public. Typically, a FOIA request is denied because it's confidential supervisory information, and then after a few decades, the records are destroyed on a regular schedule that the Fed operates. So if there's one takeaway from this book, I would hope it would encourage in this town a move toward transparency, at least when it comes to history. We couldn't get records on 1920s lending. We point out in the book, it's easier to get records from the 1860s than it is from the period of the Federal Reserve. This really is